trail. This one just kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And as I studied this out, there's more. But I think just kind of covering the broad views that have been out there historically as Christians have wrestled with the question, how do we respond to injustice? When the world is evil and wicked and injustice seems to abound, we are called to be people of imitating God, imitating Christ, to live holy lives pleasing before Him, to be advocates for justice, to pursue justice, to pursue righteousness. How do we do that in a world that's corrupt? And so we've looked so far at three views. If we're leaning over here towards the most non-responsive view, would be the view of the pacifist, or the one who says, let's just take a peaceful reproach, really basing this on turning the other cheek, don't repay evil for evil, those kinds of things. Coming clear over here to the other end of the pendulum is the conquest view, which is we've been given the sword for a reason. Let's go out and conquer the world and make people live under justice and righteousness. Last week we looked at the predominant view among Protestants, which is the just war theory, and was the prominent view of the Catholic Church from really the 1500s, 1600s up until the early 1900s. And that's kind of been the view that we're the most familiar with. And then this week we're going to get to the last view, which is going to be between just war and the pacifist view, which is going to be what has been known as the just peacemaking view, or the just peacemaking theory. And really, it's a reaction to, is there anything between justifying war and looking for the justification of war and going to war if we're justified in doing so, or the pacifist view, which just stays, you know what, we're not going to really respond. And it's not that they're passive and do nothing, but they're really going to just let things play out and accept whatever happens on the earth, and really don't try to pursue justice or make justice or force justice. They wait for the Lord alone to bring that justice. And so in the middle, a series of theologians at the end of the 1800s, along with political movements that were happening at that time, began to just wonder, is there something in between there? And as theologians began to study God's Word, they questioned the just war theory. You know, are we always looking for an excuse to go to war, or are we waiting for something bad to happen and then our only reaction is to go to war? Could we not pursue peace before we get to that stage? And what would that look like? And it just started out really with a series of questions that didn't take form because there was a few things that happened in the world that kind of set things off course. Anybody know what happened in the early 1900s? World War I, yeah, it kind of threw everything off. Last week, by the way, between World War I and World War II, talking about the predecessor to the United Nations, I said there was the New Deal. The New Deal was for the Americas to kind of rebuild the economy, which didn't work out so great. The New Deal was kind of a bad deal, but it was the League of Nations was what I was looking for. It was the League of Nations that went from World War I to World War II, and then the United Nations, as we know it today, formally formed the Geneva Convention and the practice of the United Nations in 1949. So the League of Nations failed going into World War II, and it morphed into, after World War II, the United Nations. But that kind of brings us to the hindrances to the just peacemaking theory. The world, for the most part, was at war and in economic crisis for the theologians that were thinking through these things. And so the just peacemaking theory kind of got put on the back burner. And it wouldn't be until the 1950s, 1960s, this idea starts to kind of resurface. And again, our reaction to it, and as I start to talk through it, you're going to probably feel kind of some negativity, like that doesn't sound right, that doesn't feel right, and there's reasons why, and we'll talk about those. But as really it was the Catholic Church that has kind of initiated these movements, the conquest and the Crusades, moving to a just war theory. Really, the Catholic Church as we know it, the Roman Catholic Church, never embraced the pacifist view, but that would have been the historical church. As the Roman Catholicism became the predominant view, they would have inherited that view from the early church fathers. And so as the Catholic Church tends to be on the forefront of changing models, once again they were through the 1950s and 1960s, as Catholic theologians began to question the just war theory. But the big question was, what do you put in its place? We don't believe in crusade. We're not sure that just war theory, looking for an excuse to go to war, and if we can check all the boxes, then war is the best option. We're not sure that's the most spiritual, biblical, Christ-like model, but we're not going to go back to this because, the Catholic Church wields power and we need to do something with that power. So what do we do? What do we do with the power if we don't automatically look for reasons to go to war? And the Catholic Church began to question that, and then quickly, by the 1970s and 80s, there was a group of evangelical and Protestant theologians that jumped on board with that, and they really began to get into the Scriptures, see what is it that God would have us to do in response to injustice. And by 1980, there was a book published, I should have written its title down, that advocated this just war theory. Since then, it started out with 6 points. Coming through the 90s into the early 2000s, the just war theory has pretty well settled in on 10 points. Just peacemaking, thank you. The just peacemaking theory has really settled in on 10 principles, 10 points that drive it. And so I want to kind of break you down through that. It's the newest one on the scene. It's kind of the red-headed stepchild. It's not commonly accepted, but more and more churches, more and more theologians, more and more movements among Christians are gravitating towards it. And so it's going to sound familiar to you in part of it because it is becoming more popular. So let's look into it. I'm going to pass out some verses tonight. There's a lot from the Sermon on the Mount that is the basis of this. We're not going to look at all of their passages. I'm going to take you to some others as well, but it's heavily based in Matthew 5 through 7. But tonight, if somebody would take Matthew 5, 38 through 39. Thank you, Dad. Matthew 5, 38 through 39. And then stay there because we're going to follow that up with 40 and 41. 1 Thessalonians 5:15. 1 Thessalonians 5:15. Thank you, Brett. Matthew 4:42. I'm going to go back a little bit in Matthew to chapter 4:42. Ray's got that one. I'm not going to have anyone read Romans 12. We've been through that in each of the views, but I'll just bring some elements of that out. Luke 19. I think so. Yep. Then that's not going to work. 5. Let me check this. 5:42. Sorry. Matthew 5:42. Yes. That makes more sense. I was wondering. I was like, Matthew 4. That doesn't. Okay. Luke 19, 8 through 9. Actually, Ray, I'll have Dad pick that one up. Would you take Luke 19, 8 through 10? Luke 19, 8 through 10. Hebrews 12. Hebrews 12:12. Mom's got that one. Okay, we're almost to the end of these. 1 Peter 3:13. Thank you, Miss Jean. 1 Peter 3:13. I'm going to stop there because the time's going to get away from us. So the 10 practices that have kind of settled in under the just peacemaking theory have been, one, the first principle is that the church and believers in Christ should do everything they can to support nonviolent direct action. Now, nonviolent direct action is a little different. The pacifists are doing nonviolent indirect action. Something's done to them, and so they're going to then react in an indirect way. They're not going to directly go back with a reciprocation, but they're going to do something indirectly to try to influence and try to advocate for justice. So the nonviolent direct action, this is going to be a little bit more strong in thinking through how to respond to these things. We'll talk about some of what that looks like here in a minute, but Dad, if you would read Matthew 5, 38 and 39. So their interpretation of this, the pacifist over here is saying, look, if they slap you, just let them slap you around. Just give them the other cheek, let them beat you. Their interpretation of this, and there's scholarly work that's been done on the culture of the Hebrew people and the language that's used here, and this idea of turning the other cheek isn't turning it to take another hit, but that turning the other cheek is a direct reciprocation, saying basically, if you're going to do that, I'm going to respond, and I'm going to force you to consider what you're doing. Are you really going to hit me again? And so you're challenging the person to stop and think about what they're doing, not just waiting for another hit to slap you upside the other side of your face. And so this idea of supporting nonviolent direct action, when something is going on in the world that's unjust, do something in return that's not violent. You're not hitting them back, but do something to make them stop and say, wait a minute, is this something I really want to do? Is this the right thing to do? And so these nonviolent direct actions are things like boycotts. Boycotts were really big in the 1980s in the evangelical movement. How many of you can remember the church advocating to boycott companies through the 80s and the 90s? Yeah, that was a pretty popular thing to do. Less so now. Every once in a while, you might see something on Facebook like, hey, you should boycott Target because they support this or that. And those things still float around a little bit, but you don't see the church, Christianity as a whole, calling all Christians and all people boycotting these companies. But through the 1980s and 90s, as this just peacemaking theory was really ramping up, that was a big deal. As I was studying this out, I didn't remember. I was young then, but I guess there was a huge boycott against the Nestle company. And I didn't remember that. It had something to do with baby formula and something that there was in the formula. And Christians in Europe and America both boycotted Nestle and changed the whole baby formula industry even today. I had no clue. But this was a nonviolent response that was very direct, very intentional to say, wait a minute, there's an injustice happening. Think about this. Is this something that you really want to do? And so this idea of supporting nonviolent direct action, these are things like boycotts, non-cooperation, where everyone's starting to partner with something and say, no, we're not going to partner with that, and we're going to protest, and we're going to make it known that this is something that we're against. And that really became the mantra of the beginning of the just peacemaking theory. And it had a goal. Its goal was to create dialogue to work towards the solution for that injustice. It wasn't just, we're going to try to ruin a company. The Christians didn't ever want to ruin Nestle company, nor did they ruin Nestle company. Nestle's huge today. What they wanted was Nestle to change its practices in the way that it was using the production of baby formula. And they did. And so Christians buy Nestle today. I drank Nestle Quick a ton growing up. It was part of my regular enjoyable diet. And so this is the idea is you make a statement to work towards a solution, and then you back off. You're not trying to, over here in the conquering phase, we're just going to destroy Nestle at all costs. Over here in the just war theory, we have good cause to, Nestle struck, we're going to strike back and make them pay. Nestle never paid anything. They just fixed it, and that was the goal, and then they backed off. And so it's a direct, nonviolent action. Second principle of the just peacemaking theory was to take independent initiatives to reduce threat. So you're taking preemptive action to try to bring down threat level before it arrives at conflict. So rather than going down the checklist of the just war theory, okay, did this happen, did this happen, did this happen, did this happen, what can we do to not check off those boxes? How can we make sure that we don't get to that place where we need those things? And so it's trying to be very proactive in reducing the threat. So Matthew 5:40 through 41, Dad. Okay, so here there's a potential conflict. Someone wants to sue you. You know what? Just give them not only what you need to make this problem go away, but go above and beyond that. Go the extra mile to make sure not only do they not have cause to sue you, but that you've done everything you can to avoid this escalating into something else. If they compel you to go 1 mile with them, go 2. Walk the extra mile. And that's a phrase that we have. Go the extra mile to make sure that this doesn't need to become a war, that there's no cause for it to go to a war. And as much as you can, as much as you can do, you have made visible, real actions to show that you are not interested in a conflict. And we want to pursue peace. We want to make peace. These are not, by the way, promises. And this is where a lot of the just peacemaking theory gets into trouble, because those who say, well, I'm just using the just peacemaking theory, I promise to do this, I promise to do that, but there's no action behind it, and therefore it fails. This is actually give the cloak, actually go the extra mile, make an action that shows you're pursuing peace on your part. 1 Thessalonians 5:15, I think Brett had that one. Yeah. So don't render evil for evil. So, I mean, this is kind of the basis of the pacifism view over here. But coming a little bit closer, but do what's good. Be intentional about pursuing peace and making for peace. And so do what you can proactively to avoid conflict needing to arise, that there's not going to be war because we've done everything we can to make peace prior to that. And the purpose of this is to bring down threat level. You know, as tension begins to rise, do some action that's going to bring the pressure down a little bit. Where distrust begins to form, make some actions that are going to work towards building trust. And really then, this is not to force somehow negotiations. I'm not doing these actions because a court ordered me to do so. That's the product of the just war theory. We went to war, we got the court to order, now you have to do these things. You have to pay these things. Before it comes to that, offer it freely. Show some goodwill. Put some skin in the game to work towards peace without being asked to, without being forced to. Be proactive. And that's really the second principle, is just to be proactive. Take independent initiatives to bring down threat level, to bring down tension level before war initiates. Number 3, use cooperative conflict resolution. Matthew 5:42, Dad. Yeah, so if there's a way they're coming to you saying, look, if you could do this for us, then be cooperative in that. Make those concessions. If they're coming and saying, hey, we need to borrow from you so that this doesn't escalate, or, you know, we can get through this situation, be willing to lend it. You know, in order for there to be peace, there's going to have to be some give and take. There's going to have to be some cooperation. And what happens often is in the just war theory, it can be very much that there's some sort of injustice. You're going down the checklist, and maybe 1 or 2 of those boxes aren't checked yet, but there's, you know, we want to go to war. Now there's a desire to go to war. And so where there could have been some cooperation in maybe alleviating some threat, hey, if you guys could just do this, I don't know you that, prove to me, take me to court, you know, and you escalate it by pushing back. Now you've got a reason to check that box. And so rather than finding reasons to justify war, let's pursue actively and aggressively everything we can to avoid it. And so use cooperative conflict resolution. Cooperate with the people that you're in tension with. How can we make this work? Sit down and negotiate, and don't just do things because you're forced to. Do things willingly, seeking to bring peace. And that's where if we're in Romans 12, 17, 18, where it says, as much as depends on you, live at peace with all people. We've read that in all the other views. So they interpret that as much as depends on you, live at peace with all people. You're not passively over here just saying, okay, well, then I'm just going to take it and take it and take it so that I don't create tension and make war. Over here, on the just war theory, as much as depends on you, hey, we did everything we could, but we're justified now in this. This view would interpret Romans 12:17 as saying, be aggressive in pursuing peace, as much as depends on you. Have you pursued it with every means possible, with all your heart? How can we avoid war? How can we avoid conflict? Have you done that? And so, really what this seeks to do, and the goal of this, of using this cooperative conflict resolution, is to humanize people. Because over here, once you get to the place of war, and especially once you get over here to the place of conquest, you have to, in some ways, in order to pursue that, you have to dehumanize people. And you'll see that. People all of a sudden aren't people anymore. They're well, we give them a name. They're Charlie. They're Ivan. We name them something so that they're less than human. They're cockroaches. They're beasts. You give them some term other than a person. Here in the just war theory, the enemy we dehumanize, but we try to humanize the civilian population. And by the way, if you ever wonder why so many soldiers get court-martialed, it's because that line gets really blurry, especially when you're in urban warfare. And I knew people in Iraq that had to go stand before court-martial trials because they fired into a crowd when people were firing at them, but in that crowd there were unarmed people. And so now they were the villain because they fired at unarmed people in a crowd. And it just gets so confusing. Over here, the just peacemaking people are like, even the person shooting at you, that's a human, and there's a reason they're shooting at you. Sit down and try to find out, what is it? Why are they pulling triggers at you? They're human people. Empathize with them, understand them, try to figure out what hurt is so deep in them that they're pulling triggers, and get to know what it is that they're fighting for, so that we can then come in and cooperatively find a solution to move towards peace. And so this is kind of the idea of using the cooperative conflict resolution, that we pursue peace as much as we can, as much as depends on you. Number 4, acknowledge responsibility for conflict and injustice, seek repentance and forgiveness. So this would come from an example like Zacchaeus. Ray has Luke 19, 8 through 10. Amen. So here we have Zacchaeus. He's confronted with the presence of Jesus Christ. He recognizes his sin, and he stands before Christ, and he says, look, Lord, I know that I've wronged. I know what I've done. And so whatever I've stolen, I'm going to pay back, and I'm going to pay it back fourfold. I'm going to go and I'm going to give recompense. I'm going to give restitution to those who I wronged. And he owns his own sin. He owns his own part in provoking injustice in others. And he goes to those people and says, I want to make this right. There's a movie called The Flywheel. It's an old Kendricks Brothers film. I think it was their first one, maybe. And in that, he owns a car dealership. And he had fudged on a little bit of the details of the cars that he had sold. Not necessarily had cheated anything, but maybe he told him the car was worth this, or maybe he told him the car was in really good shape and he knew it had some problems. And so when the Lord convicted him of this, he went to all of those people and he said, look, I went through the files, I charged you this much, but the car was really worth this much, so I'm going to pay you back the balance of what I overcharged you. And that's the idea of this acknowledging responsibility for the conflict, acknowledging responsibility for the part that we've played in creating this hostility, in creating this tension. And own it, reflect on it, look inward, and rather than pointing the finger, and this is where this statement has become very popular, every time you point the finger at someone else, you have 4 of them pointing back at you. I usually have 3 because I always shoot people when I point. But, nonetheless, when you point that finger, these fingers are pointing back. Look in. Look in. Where have we contributed to this? What part have we played in this? And then make right what we can make right. Own what we've done. And so today, when we hear things like restitution, we kind of cringe at that a little bit. Why? Why does that word restitution make us cringe in our current situation in society? Right. The people that were harmed aren't here anymore. That's true. That's true. The people that hurt them aren't here anymore. That's right. Good. Why else? Because it doesn't fix it. That's it. And yeah, I could go and I could give you this, I could give you that, and you know what? It doesn't solve the problem. And so these are the kinds of things that when we hear them and we see how that plays out in the world, and then all of a sudden, and this is where the rub comes in, instead of the just peacemaking theory, which comes from looking in, and as Zacchaeus of his own free will said, this is what I want to do, I want to move forward, it gets turned around, and it's now we need to force this to happen. We need to force restitution. And really what happens when that moment occurs, when it goes from, of my own free will, we want to do this, to, no, you've been judged guilty and you will now pay this back, we actually switched from a just peacemaking into a just war theory under the label of just peacemaking theory, and that kind of creates a pushback on most of our part. And so we need to just understand what's happening in our culture, what's happening in our society. As a nation, as a people, we are torn right now between two very, very predominant models. And part of the culture is still thinking just war theory, and this is the way things work. And part of our culture is thinking just peacemaking, and this is the way we should find solutions to things. But they're actually flipping them back and forth, and they start to mix together and mold together, and that creates inside of us kind of just a pushback. It doesn't feel right because it's inconsistent. And I'll honestly say, biblically, if you're going to be under one model, theologians have wrestled with this and battled with this, and they've fallen under this. Others have interpreted Scripture and come with this. Others have interpreted Scripture and come with that. And if you are consistent in a model, at least in your mind and in your heart, you feel like you have a way that justice is being dealt with, whatever model you fall under. But when they start to mix and blend and twist and turn, all of a sudden you feel in turmoil inwardly, and the reaction to that is usually a pushback. And that's what our culture is going through. That's why there's so much stress and hurt and animosity between political parties and people and churches even that don't get along, because these models are starting to blur together, and they are in many ways incompatible because they look at the world from very, very different lenses. So that's why when we're in this just peacemaking model, it's important to understand when we're talking about restitution, we're not talking about forced restitution from a judgment or a people that have judged this is what needs to be done. This is inward reflection and of the own volition, of the own free will, saying, I want to come and do everything I can to make this right. And that model is functional. It can work. But when you start mixing it, that's where we start to push back against words like restitution. Does that make sense? A little bit? Am I losing you? Okay, let's go on. Number 5. Part of the foundation of the just peacemaking theory is to advance democracy, human rights, and religious liberty. It's based out of Hebrews 12:12 through 13. Can't remember who I gave Hebrews 12 to. Hebrews 12:12 and 13, Mom. Yeah. So here you've got weak, downhearted, downtrodden people. Make them strong. Give them strength. Make a way for people that have no hope to voice their voice, to share with the world their injustice. And when we pursue things to advance human rights, to advance democracy, to allow those who don't have a voice, to be heard, these things are wrong. These things are hurtful. These things are harmful. rather than having maybe monarchies or bureaucracies where you have, these big oligarchs who are making all the decision that are affecting the people, but the people don't have any way to cry out and say, but what you're doing is killing us, it's hurting us, it's handicapping us. And so by giving people voice, by giving people nonviolent means to speak and to be heard, all of a sudden now you bring the threat level down to war. What was the crux behind the French Revolution? How many of you have studied history a little bit and know the things that led up to the French Revolution? Yeah. Yes. What was that, Callie? Yes, the aristocrats. So the economically, what was happening was the system was being very intentionally built that the top held everything. And anybody tried to break out of that and succeed in their own trade, in their own affair or entreprise. I can't think of the word in English. Entrepreneurship. Thank you. Yes. Man, does that happen to you sometimes? You just can't get the right word to come in the right language? I don't know. Anyway, the innovation was crushed. And the power stayed with the elite, and finally the people, years after years after years of watching their children suffer and starve and die, they couldn't take it, and they reacted with violence. And they felt like they had no other choice. And so as England watched that, fortunately, the English had a little bit of wisdom, and had they not reacted in some ways, England very well could have suffered the same fate as France with a revolution and an overthrow of the monarchy. And so they created the system now of having a prime minister, having the House, having the people have some sort of a voice where they felt like they could be heard, where their arguments could be made, where they had some voice in the decision-making process of the nation, and that allowed the monarchy to remain, even though it was in some ways significantly changed. And so this idea that by advocating for democracy, giving people religious liberty to worship and to voice without having to go to war, give them an alternate to fighting, and people will generally take the alternate to fighting. Now, I will say one of the weaknesses of this view, and this is where it really now is going to start to come out. And as we go through the next few steps quickly, you're going to see this view of the just peacemaking theory presumes that if you treat people nicely, they're going to treat you nicely. And that's the presumption of the just peacemaking theory. And this is where it's going to fall short. Remember, it's rooted originally in Catholic doctrine. In Catholic doctrine, people are basically good, and you baptize them as infants to kind of start that grace in them, and they're just going to kind of grow and become better people and more productive, and they'll become more spiritual. And people are generally good, so we're trying to unlock the good in people. And many evangelical and many Protestant denominations hold similar views to where they view people as basically good. And that's a popular view in our culture today. You talk to many people, and they'll say, well, babies are born innocent. If they're messed up, it's because we messed them up. People are generally good, and so if you treat people nice, they'll treat you nice. And those principles are kind of rooted into this just peacemaking theory. And so the idea here, give people a good alternative to do the right thing, and they will. They'll do the right thing if you give them an opportunity. Now, we know then that the heart is deceitful, above all things, and desperately wicked. We know that the human nature is corrupt and defiled, and things like greed and jealousy and rage, those things are inherent in our human nature. And so even though you may give people a choice to do good and give them every opportunity to do good, some people, some nations, some groups are going to choose to do evil anyway. And the just peacemaking theory recognizes that, but they downplay it. And, well, just keep trying. Just keep trying. Just keep giving them a chance. Eventually the good will come out. And so now we're going to start to see then where that really ramps up. Number 6, then, in the just peacemaking theory, we should foster just and reasonable, sustainable economic development. And the idea is based out of Hebrews chapter 12, that if you give people an ability to survive, give them means to survive, and bitterness and jealousy and rage will go away. And so people fight because they do not have. This goes back to James chapter 4. They fight because they don't have. They don't have because they don't ask. They don't ask because they ask amiss. And in James chapter 4, if we just make a way that everybody could have adequate living, everyone could have equal lifestyle, if everybody had a certain form of equality in economics, in privilege, in rights, in education, don't turn anyone away. Everybody should get a high school diploma, and so if you just make everybody equal in every way, then all of a sudden there's going to be no fighting, there's going to be no war, there's going to be no robberies and deaths. All of that will go off the table because everyone will have their basic needs and everyone will be basically even. And this is where the just peacemaking theory then really shows this idea that if people are basically good, then that will come out of them if we cultivate that. And so the idea is that they'll provide people with means to survive, and as doing that, then people will thrive in that environment. It's very optimistic. It's very hopeful. It's very, let's cultivate good things and good things will come back to you. They base some of this out of Galatians chapter 6. You reap what you sow. If you want peace, then you need to make things peaceful. And if you want people to be happy, you need to give them an opportunity to be happy. So a lot of these kinds of things then start to come into it. And this is where those of us that have the doctrine of sin and what it does in the human heart, that's where we start to push back a little bit and say, that's a little bit too hopeful. Because there's a little problem of sin, and sin isn't as easily cured as just do nice things and people will be nice. It's rooted deeper than that. It's uglier than that. And without Jesus Christ transforming the heart, then there will not really be a transformation. People, you can give them all you want, give them all the rights and opportunity that you want, but some are still going to do bad things. Injustice is still going to occur. And so this is where we start to push back a little bit often in our thinking, and it's not wrong to push back and say, you know what, that's probably a little overly optimistic, looking at the reality of the world in which we live. Number 7, then work with emerging cooperative forces in the international system. 1 Peter 3:13. I can't remember who I gave that one to. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? The just peacemaking theory says, there's nothing, they recognize there is no sin that's common to one person or one group. Sin is sin. It exists all over the world. Injustice is injustice. You can go to any country, they're battling the same things. You've got economic control, you've got poverty, you've got slavery, and it looks at different forms and in different ways, and there's no world that exists without sin. So there's the common temptation. It's all over the world. So by battling these things in partnerships internationally, if you align with that which is good, then the result will be good. So if there's international movements happening to stop sex trafficking, then let's partner with those international movements to stop sex trafficking. If there's international movements to stop the opioid crisis, we're not going to fix the opioid crisis here in Idaho. We all know those are coming through Texas. They're coming through Mexico. The chain of events that leads to the opioids getting into Idaho crosses international borders, and to solve the problem, we're going to have an international partnership. And so the idea is, look at the big picture. We're not going to win the injustice battle in our own backyard when the source of injustice is an international problem. So let's work together with these cooperative forces to partner and battle these things, because they're bigger than just a local problem. And there's a part of that, I think, that resonates with us. If you've been aware recently of the sex trafficking that goes on, do we not feel like somebody should do something about that? We need to get involved in that somehow. But I guarantee you, here in Notice, Idaho, we're not going to stop the sex trafficking trade. But by partnering with international groups that are battling that, we can. We can do something. And that's the idea, is that if we pursue that which is good and we partner with those things that are good, we're going to see good results. That comes out of 1 Peter 3. I will say that verse is slightly twisted in context. And each of these views, whatever one you hold, we end up having to play acrobats with some verses in the Bible to make it fit perfectly, because none of them do fit perfectly. I can make a pretty strong case that the conquest view over here of crusading isn't consistent with a New Testament model. In the Old Testament, in the days of Israel, yes. But for those of us who are dispensationalists and believe that in Christ we have changed, we now are operating under grace and we have a new way with the Holy Spirit living inside of us, then we're not operating under that conquest mentality anymore. I think we can make an argument for that for the church. But the other three views, the church has adopted, has wrestled with these things, and at some point, whatever view you sit in, there's some verses that just kind of poke you a little bit and don't fit into the worldview. So, that's one of them. I think they've twisted a little bit to make their point. But I think their case is valid, that we do need to be willing to work with others if we want to see some changes on a global scale. Number 8, strengthen the UN and international efforts for cooperation and human rights. This would be based on principles like Ecclesiastes 4:12. Two-strand cord is easily broken, but a three-strand cord cannot easily be broken. Two men can fall, but three are strong. These kinds of things. And by partnering together to battle injustice, we're stronger together than we are apart. And so by getting behind the UN and other things that are trying to go in and say, you know what, this region is in total chaos and total war. What are the problems? What are the root issues here? Well, one, the people are starving. Okay, well, let's get some food in there. Well, they're dying of cholera. Okay, let's get some medication in there. What is going on that's the root of these issues? Partnering with international groups, trying to find out what those causes are, treat those causes so that the people are prone to pursuing peace and not fighting over the few medicines that are there, or fighting over the few food supplies that are there in a region. Let's battle against that and try to find solutions that will provide enough for everyone that we can alleviate some of the war. Now, the idea of that is, though, if we find the solution to the problem and we treat it, the problem will go away, and it doesn't deal with things like bitterness, jealousies, revenge, the desire to avenge. You can take tribes that were fighting over the same water source for years, give them each a water source, and they keep fighting. Why? Why did the Hatfields and the McCoys go at it for so long? They don't remember. Killed my brother. There's animosity. And so what international groups analyzing the source of the problem and the origin of the problem and treating the symptom of that original problem, what they can't fix is the broken hearts. And so, although the just peacemaking theory, I think, is good, and by working together, maybe we can get to the root of some of these things, what it can't do is provide a solution to the anger, the bitterness, the revenge, the you shot my brother, so I'm going to shoot yours kind of stuff that goes on generation after generation. Last 2 points. Reduce the offensive weapons and the weapons trade. This comes out of Isaiah 2:4. And this idea is that if you give people something with the intention of allowing them to just, here, we're going to give you this so you can go fight for what you want, then they're going to fight for what they want. If you give them defensive tools to say, you know what, how can we pursue peace, but should we be attacked, we can defend ourselves, but don't have necessarily offensive weapons to start and instigate something, then you're going to decline the desire to go to war. People will want to feel secure much more than they're going to have a desire to go and to take and attack and to kill. Now, again, this is rooted in the idea that people are basically good. And if you assume people are basically good, then they're going to want to make home and safe, and they're not going to want to go out and destroy somebody else's home. When you put sin in the mix and you put anger, rage, violence, all those things into people's hearts, unfortunately, even if they don't have weapons that are designed specifically to attack, they're still going to look for ways to attack. And so the idea of the just peacemaking theory is, though, if I know my enemy has the capability of attacking me, then I'm going to make sure I have a capability of attacking them. And really, remember, this is 1980s as this is ramping up. What's going on in the 1980s? The Cold War with the Soviets. Well, the Soviets have 580 nukes, so we better have 600 nukes. Well, now we have 600 nukes, so the Soviets, well, we need 750 nukes. And the thing just escalates and escalates and escalates, and pretty soon, what's everybody afraid of? Who's going to push the button? Who's going to push the button? And so if we can de-escalate the number of offensive weapons, focus on protection and securing of safety and peace, then we can de-escalate situations and have less war. So that's kind of the concept. The concept, I think, is good, but again, it doesn't deal with the reality of human hearts. And so that's one of the weaknesses of the view. But they advocate by de-escalating offensive weapons. Let's take our swords, let's beat them into plowshares. Let's take what could be used to destroy and make it build safety and security and economy at home. And they'll say things like, boy, if we took our weapons budget and we took half of that and we put that into our own economy and economic growth, we could create 5 million jobs, but instead, we've got 5 million bombs buried in a bunker somewhere. So, that's kind of the arguments that go behind it. Let's not focus on attacking. Let's focus on building safety, security, economy, and that will promote peace. Again, very optimistic, not very realistic with the human heart. And the last one, and this is where we'll wrap up. Encourage grassroots peacemaking groups and voluntary associations. Matthew 5:21 through 26, going back to the beginning part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the importance of being in good terms with people. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. Whomever murders will be in danger of judgment. But I say to you, whoever's angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you're on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. And really the idea of this, have these grassroots movements, is have advocacy groups, people that are saying, hey, what do we need to do to be right with the people around us? How do we live at peace? How do we promote peace amongst each other, amongst our neighbors? They'll go to passages in the Old Testament. As I was studying this in our men's Bible study, we're studying the life of Abraham. And I noticed something there that ties right into this. As Abraham and Lot chose two different regions, Lot chose the area around Sodom and Gomorrah because it looked better, it was fertile, he wanted to feed his flock down there. So Abram went the other direction, went up into the high country, a little hilly, a little rocky, not quite so much to eat up there, but he made a living there. And as you come into then when the wars are going to happen in Genesis 14 between the kings, and Lot ends up being taken, and Abraham has to rally his people and go save him, it says that Abraham had allies of these two families in that land. And Abraham, as he took that high ground, he moved into that high country, that less favorable for the flocks and the sheep. He moved into that land where resources were certainly more difficult to secure, water more difficult, food for his flocks more difficult. And as he moved in there, he made friends with those people, and he made allies. And this became sort of a grassroots group that they had peace between themselves. So when Lot was taken, Abram was able to leave, go pursue that, came back, and his flocks and his family weren't destroyed because he had friends that were there pursuing peace. And that's the idea of the just peacemaking theory, is create places where people can talk, where people can work it out, where people can be friends. When there's problems between neighbors, when there's problems between nations, you can come together, you can find solutions and pursue peace rather than just saying, oh, we were wronged, so we can check one box off the list. Now, how do we retaliate? Can we retaliate? Will our government authorize us to retaliate? And go down the list before we can somehow find a way to pursue peace. And that's really the crux of the just peacemaking theory is before we come over to this, and rather than just being forced to sit here under this, is there something in between where we're proactively, productively working, hopefully, and I will say over-optimistically at times, towards peace? And that's really the crux of the just peacemaking theory. And so those are the four views that are out there on how the church, how Christians should respond to injustice. There are others that are kind of subcategories of those and nuances. I've chosen not to go into all that. If you want to learn more, I found some pretty good resources on this that I can get you, and you can do some more research on your own. But in a broad sense, that's really the four reactions to injustice. So, questions or comments? Wouldn't that be a great world to live in? And that statement is from a very rooted just peacemaking theory. Let's make the first move. Let's show some good intention. Let's do what's right. And if we do good, people will do good back to us. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It wasn't the road to take. And this is, I'll just share with you my personal view. Where I've kind of come over the years, young guys, we're always looking for a battle. You know, I was probably here in a lot of areas. I can remember saying, you know, why don't we just go shoot the doctors doing abortions? You know, if we just shot them all in the head, that would be the end of it. Why don't we just take all the gay people, send them off to an island, one generation, they'll all be gone. They can't reproduce. So I remember thinking that, feeling that as a Christian. You know, why do we allow these things to happen? It didn't last very long. As you know, that's very young, immature, I think, thinking. But I remember thinking that and feeling that, and moved over here, especially knowing the history of our nation, learning the history of our theology and why we do what we do. I was very comfortable in the just war theory, and I still advocate for it. And I think that there are times when it is absolutely necessary because the heart is deceitful and wicked. And there are people in the world like Hitler who will not be reasoned with. Their heart is bent on evil. And so we need to be able to react to injustices. We need to be able to protect Jews from being destroyed in Holocaust. And so we have to, at some point, be able to have a process that allows us to know God would want us to protect these people. If I see a woman getting beat up by her boyfriend out in a parking lot, I'm not going to just sit over here and tell her, boy, you know, he's just getting your right side, turn the left side to him a little bit. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to step in and say, that's not okay. You're not going to treat her that way. And so we need some process to bring us to that. However, I think the best is to start here. In most cases. Now, in that situation, you need to step in. But in most cases, if I know there's tension in a marriage, I'm not going to go right to, you know, let's get in and start a war. If there's tension in a marriage, let's pursue peace. Let's get in. Let's work on this. Let's try to find those compromises. What can we do proactively to regain trust and to rebuild relationship, to live at peace with all people? And this is really where I want to put a lot of effort and energy in most conflict situations. And then I believe there are some things now that really just are the Lord's. And he's not calling me to battle those things. He's not calling me to fix those things. And some things I just give to him and say, Lord, I really don't know what to do about that, and I just give it to you. And whatever comes on me because of that, then I'm just going to have to accept it. And that's where you end up with Paul in prison, you know, and preaching to the jailers there. And there are just some things that surpass our ability. We know we can't fight. The Lord's not asking us to fight on this issue. We've tried these peacemaking things, and it hasn't gotten us where we hope to be. And so there are some things that in faith we just have to accept. And that's kind of where I'm at. I've tried to think in the last few weeks, is there anything that would push me back over to this side where I think we just have to fight, conquer, win, kill at all costs? And I really couldn't think of a scenario. It doesn't mean there isn't one, but I couldn't really think of a scenario where I would feel God calling me to fight to the death, killing everybody in my path because the cause is so great we need to win it. I'm not sure I could think of anything there. Again, doesn't mean there isn't something. Just in my mind, trying to wrestle with it, I didn't come up with something. And so I really bobble, I think, between these two the most right here, and then some things that just are too big for me, I'm going to give them to God and just accept whatever comes. That kind of makes sense? That's where I'm at. I'm not saying that's where you need to be, and I'm not saying that's where the church always needs to be. It's just those are the views that Christianity has wrestled with over the years. All right. Any other questions? I'm going to close that can of worm. Tried to get them all poked back in. I hope I didn't create more questions than answers. All right. If you got your prayer sheet tonight, I just want to bring you up to date on